Hello, I'm Joni Alberg, and welcome to our keynote session, Contributions of Early Vocabulary Knowledge to Literacy Growth in Children with Cochlear Implants and Hearing Aids. We're delighted to have you here with us this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Just a reminder, by now you probably know, but the tabs for oral translation and written captioning are to the right of the chat button. Use those to select the language that you prefer. Also, I see many of you have already posted in the chat to tell us where you're from. It's always nice to see how far-reaching this symposium really is. With me today is Andrea Hernandez, who's here to translate our questions. Any questions you might have that are posed in Spanish, she'll translate them to English for us. And if you have questions for the presenter, please use the Q&A tab. And finally, please stay for the entire session if you are earning CEUs and complete the session feedback and CEU learning assessment at the end of the session. So now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Dr. Emily Lund is an associate professor at Texas Christian University. Her line of research focuses on language and literacy development in children who struggle with language secondary to another diagnosis, primarily hearing loss. Her work has been funded by the NIH, National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders, the ASH Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Education. Dr. Lund?
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation. I'm going to be talking to you today about the contributions of early vocabulary knowledge to literacy growth in children with cochlear implants and with hearing aids. Sure. Some quick disclosures. I'm an employee at Texas Christian University, and some of the research I talk about today, I'm paid to do by that university. Data in today's presentation has been supported by some grants from the NIH and IDCD, and one in particular, the ELLA study, the Early Language and Literacy Acquisition in Children with Hearing Loss study that I share with Dr. Crystal Werfel. And I'm so pleased to be here today. Our outcomes today really revolve around thinking differently about vocabulary knowledge. As most of the participants here probably know, our children who are deaf and hard of hearing and learning spoken language often begin developing their language skills later than their peers with typical hearing. And so they start out with a language delay. But when we look at measures of single word vocabulary, we often see that children who received early intervention and early amplification might catch up in terms of their single word vocabulary knowledge to their peers. So I'm challenging you today to think about vocabulary in a different way, because when we really do a deep dive in vocabulary, we see that there are still some differences that remain when a child is listening through a cochlear implant or a hearing aid, and it has some cascading effects on other skills. So today we're going to describe different types of vocabulary knowledge and how they relate to the domains of language. We're going to talk about the relationship between vocabulary and early literacy acquisition. And we're going to think about how listening through a hearing aid or a cochlear implant influences later decoding and comprehension, so that literacy knowledge through vocabulary. To get us started, I want to introduce you to the ELLA study. This is the one I referenced before, and it has that little ELLA logo with the book. Anytime I'm talking about data throughout this presentation from the ELLA study, I'm going to try to flag it with that logo so you know where this data comes from. The ELLA study is a longitudinal study that's funded by NIH and IDCD, and it includes 100 children recruited from across the United States who are deaf and hard of hearing. 48 of them wear hearing aids, and 52 of them wear cochlear implants. Those numbers used to be different, but we know sometimes children switch devices. They enrolled in our study when they were 4 years old, and we've been tracking them through third grade. And these are all primarily spoken English users. So these are children who are developing listening and spoken language skills. We also have a group of 60 children in this participant sample who are children with typical hearing, who are recruited also from a lot of these same broadly geographic areas to match our children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Within the ELLA study, we have been tracking these children since age 4, that's that time 1 in the preschool phase, And in preschool, we tested their language and literacy development every 6 months. So at age 4, 4.5, 5, 5.5, and 6. And then we've kept most of these children in our study for testing again the summer after grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. And so I'm going to present some of my data to you today so that we can think about how vocabulary is driving some of our later language outcomes. So to get started, I'd like us to take a look at vocabulary knowledge broadly. So really we start by asking, what do we know about vocabulary outcomes in the United States for children with cochlear implants and hearing aids? Well, you can see on these graphs here, I've plotted scores from the expressive one-word picture vocabulary test and the Peabody picture vocabulary test. So expressive and receptive vocabulary outcomes at times 1 through 5. So as a reminder, that's age 4, 4.5, 5, 5.5, and 6. And what you can see in terms of overall vocabulary knowledge is that my green line, that's our friends with typical hearing, stays on top across all of the ages. That represents the mean. The orange line, our children with hearing aids, is somewhere in the middle. And our blue line, the cochlear implant children, remain on the bottom. So over time, we see that they start out behind their peers with some overlap in skills. So we do have some children performing like our typical hearing children. And up through age 6, we still see a little bit of a vocabulary gap for our children who are listening through devices and our children with typical hearing on these single word measures of vocabulary knowledge. So I'm either showing them a picture and asking them what the name of that picture is, or I'm asking them to point to a picture. But something that I'm seeing show up increasingly in the literature is that vocabulary, especially single word vocabulary, appears to be a relative strength for children with cochlear implants and with hearing aids. So I pulled some recent publications that have reported on vocabulary data, expressive and receptive, in children who are cochlear implant users and children who are hard of hearing and often hearing aid users. And I've been thinking about how many of those children maybe look different than their peers with typical hearing, but still fall in the range of normal. So if we look at what a score 1 standard deviation below the mean would be, that falls here on this orange line. And our lighter colored bars here represent children who have cochlear implants or children who are hard of hearing and wear hearing aids. And what you see, so those bars come right up to their mean performance on these single word measures of vocabulary, is that oftentimes our children with cochlear implants and our children with hearing aids are on average performing at about a standard deviation or just above the mean expected for children with typical hearing. That would be at about 100. And even if we go a standard deviation and a half below, we see that there are a lot of children who are deaf and hard of hearing who are performing in the range of normal on single word vocabulary. So that's great news. We've got kids who are learning single words, they're naming pictures, they're pointing to pictures. They still look different than their well-matched peers with typical hearing, but we've got some pretty good outcomes in terms of overall quantity of vocabulary knowledge. I'd like to argue to you, however, that we need to be thinking, though, about not just how many words our children who are deaf and hard of hearing and learning spoken language know, but also we really need to be thinking about which words those children are learning, because this is where current research is really piecing out differences for our children who listen through cochlear implants and children who listen through hearing aids. So some examples of some studies that are showing us that maybe there are other differences in vocabulary knowledge beyond single word knowledge include these kinds of tasks. So if we look at studies, and just examples here, if we look at studies that look at taxonomic flexibility, for example, we find that children with cochlear implants are using fewer taxonomic labels, superordinate taxonomic or category labels, than children with typical hearing. So that tells us something about their understanding of categories. When we look at novel word extension tasks, we see that children with hearing aids and cochlear implants are less likely to extend new words to objects of the same shape. This is a shape bias that's typical and helps children with typical hearing know how to extend the words they know to other objects so that we don't have to teach everything individually. In studies that use error analysis to capture depth of vocabulary knowledge, we see differences in children who are hard of hearing and children with typical hearing that would indicate that maybe our children who are listening through devices have some trouble with vocabulary depth. And verbal fluency tasks give us some indications that the organization strategies that children who have cochlear implants in the case of this study or hearing aids in some of our other studies, we see indications that some of our children struggle to organize the words that they know. And when you struggle to organize the words that you know, you also have some trouble retrieving them. So there's abundant evidence emerging indicating that we need to be thinking about other types of vocabulary knowledge beyond just does the child know the name of this object or can the child point to this particular object? Today specifically, I want to try to convince you that there are two types of word knowledge that may have long-term effects on other domains of language and literacy development, because we know vocabulary is just a building block for other types of language knowledge. And so we're going to zero in on these two types today. We're going to zero in on concept word knowledge, and we're going to zero in on organizational word knowledge to really think about how the types of these words or the types of word knowledge that children who are deaf and hard of hearing have in these areas might be driving some of the other difficulties we see later as they grow in their language knowledge. So let's start with concept words. What is a concept word? A concept word is a category of words that change in meaning based on their referent. And so I have some examples for you. Here we have a pencil and a thumbtack. And my concept word that I want to use to describe these is large. So large, in this case, really applies to the pencil. And it has particular meaning, the concept of large, relative to the reference that I am using. But if I compare a pencil to a teacher, we find that the pencil is no longer large. The teacher is large. So this word doesn't have a consistent referent the way, say, apple has a pretty consistent referent, but rather the concept of large is really dependent on my referent, what I'm referring to. So large is a pretty straightforward concept word. We can also think about a concept word that's spatially sequential or temporally sequential. So this would be like the word first. In this case, I have a boy and a girl running a race, and because of the way they're positioned, if I'm using the word first, we know that the boy is first in this race. But then if we reposition them, the referents have changed who is first, and thus the way I apply first to this concept is different. Now the girl is first, or if we look at the kids facing each other, now nobody is first. And so concept words are those words that are not terribly concrete and sometimes difficult to teach because their meaning can change based on the words around that particular word. What do we know then about concept words in children who are deaf and hard of hearing? One of the things that we know is that differences in concept word knowledge can emerge early. So in a study that we did in my lab, albeit about 10 years ago, so some of these numbers may change a little bit, we looked at the composition of the first 100 words acquired by children with cochlear implants and the first 100 words acquired by a matched group of children with typical hearing. Now, we talked about before that children who are listening through a device or who have experienced a period of deafness often start learning language later than children with typical hearing. And so it's not surprising that our children in this study who have cochlear implants acquired their first 100 words later than children with typical hearing. And in this case, our mean age at implantation for our children with cochlear implants was about 14 months. When we looked at the composition of their first 100 words, however, so slightly different ages here, we found that of the 27 possible concept words that kids could have, according to the MacArthur Bates, where we were measuring their first 100 words, children with typical hearing in their first 100 words had on average 15 concept words, whereas children with cochlear implants in our sample had 2 concept words. So we see already a vocabulary composition difference that emerges kind of early. And then if we track what happens over time, which we've done in the Ellis study, that difference appears to persist. So within the Ellis study, we took, I believe it was 110 of our participants, and we looked at from age 4 to age 6 what happened to their knowledge of concept words. And we did this with the Bracken Basic Concept Scale. What we found was that at age 6, there were still significant differences, or that children with hearing aids and cochlear implants were still significantly lower in their concept vocabulary knowledge, particularly for quantity concept words, time and sequence concept words, and direction position concept words. And in fact, the quantity disparity grew between age 4 and age 6 for our children who were deaf and hard of hearing. And a lot of these children have vocabulary, single word vocabulary scores that are in the range of normal. So again, we're just kind of seeing some differences, not necessarily in the number of words that they know, but in the types of words that they know. And it emerges early and it persists all the way up to school entry, which may later create some issues. So concept knowledge is one of the types of vocabulary knowledge that I want you to think about as being potentially different for children who are learning spoken language and listening through cochlear implants or hearing aids. The other type of word knowledge that I want you to consider is what I would call organizational word knowledge. When we learn new words as word learners, spoken language users, we subconsciously have to integrate that new word into a network of word knowledge that we have. So it's not enough just for me to learn the name of a picture like dog. But when I acquire dog into my vocabulary, my brain needs a way to file that word according to other things that I know. So other items that might be filed with dog could include same level items like cat or bird. So one of the organization systems as a typical language user that my brain has access to lets me know that semantically cat and bird are related to dog, and I can file that word there or kind of create an appendix that's organized by basic connections. I also have the option of using a phonological organization system, and we see children, even from a fairly young age, do this too. So they have a subconscious phonological filing system in their brain for the words that they know. In this case, if my brain is trying to file this new word dog, and presumably if I know these other words, it might file it next to dig, which has that same initial and final phoneme, but a different central vowel. Or it might file it next to frog. Frog and dog share that same nucleus that we're listening to in that word. Or I might file dog next to doc because they share a lot of the same phonological features. So I have access to semantic organization, and I have access to phonological or sound-based organization. I also have access to taxonomy. So I might know that dog is related to pets. I might know that dog is related to animals. And I have access to kind of thematic semantic relations too that might be more syntactic, really, that a dog might eat a bone, or I use a leash to take a dog on a walk. And so all of these organization systems during typical language development are created for a child and make it easier to pull words back up and to know things about words and to be able to use words in context or predict what's coming next. So organizational word knowledge is also really important. What then do we know about organizational knowledge in children who are deaf and hard of hearing? Well, this has been something I've been thinking about fairly recently, and there are a couple of things that we've discovered. Relative to that phonological organization, so if you remember that dog could be paired with frog or could be paired with doc, those systems of organization that are phonological rely on neighborhood density of words. So a high density word is like other words that you know in your lexicon, and hopefully you can store them all together so that you can efficiently parse through the words that you know. When we look at what might be different for children who are deaf and hard of hearing, we find that children who are deaf and hard of hearing do not, even if they have those words in their vocabulary, do not appear to take advantage of phonological connections between words in the same way as children with typical hearing. And in this study specifically, we were looking at children with cochlear implants. So we have a sense that their phonological organization might not be developing in the same way as it does for children with typical hearing. And in a more recent study with a larger sample size from the Ella study, we found that children who are deaf and hard of hearing tended to know fewer high density words in their overall vocabulary than children with typical hearing. And that makes some sense too, because it's hard to learn new words that sound like other words you know. But that's not a barrier for word learning in children with typical hearing. So phonologically based organization might be different between our children with typical hearing and our children who are deaf and hard of hearing. And we see some evidence that semantic knowledge about organization or semantic organization might be different for children who are deaf and hard of hearing and children who have typical hearing. So in an early study in my lab, we found that children with cochlear implants show delayed use of superordinate relations between words, meaning they didn't always understand that a dog could also be called an animal, even if they had both of those words in their lexicon. They performed much more like their vocabulary size matched peers or their younger peers. And so we see some delay in their understanding of taxonomic organization. And in a more recent study from the Ella data, we've also found that when we start digging into how children organize their vocabulary knowledge in early elementary school, that children who are deaf and hard of hearing use fewer semantic strategies to organize their words than do children with typical hearing. And so that's a flag to us that maybe organizational vocabulary knowledge for children who are listening through hearing aids and cochlear implants looks different than it does for children with typical hearing. And that's not necessarily something we're capturing on the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. So these are things we want to pay attention to. So then, if we're thinking about how vocabulary knowledge might influence other things, we want to ask the question, why would these differences matter for language and literacy? So I want to orient you here to some models or some constructs. I want to take a minute to make sure that we're all on the same page about what goes into spoken language and what goes into literacy. So I've been talking about vocabulary for a while, but really vocabulary is just a building block for spoken language and lots of other domains of language. So it's really important for us to understand that language is not just vocabulary, but it's also syntax, the way you put your words together. It's morphology, what the pieces of words are that have meaning within words. Phonology and how you understand your language's sound system. And pragmatics, that social use of language. Semantics, of course, so vocabulary are really important, but these other things are important too. And they all feed into the development of literacy. So when literacy develops, in preschool, we know that children have emergent literacy skills. And those big three emergent literacy skills that are really going to be malleable and predict our later conventional literacy skills include your oral language knowledge. So you have to have an oral language base to develop literacy. Your print knowledge, so that's your knowledge of letter sound correspondences and how print works in books. And you have to have phonological processing. So being able to recognize individual phonemes in words. You have to have some working memory for phonology, all kinds of good things. And all of that comes together to build your conventional literacy skills. Now, conventional literacy, we most often talk about as being comprised of your decoding skills, so your ability to like sound out words, and your comprehension skills. So you need to have both to be able to read fluently. So this is kind of our overview for how we're going to start thinking about how vocabulary contributes to these other skills. So we're starting here with our vocabulary. I've been talking to you about concept vocabulary and organizational vocabulary knowledge. And so I want to walk us through how knowledge of these very specific word types might drive outcomes in other areas. So let's start with concept word knowledge. Concept word knowledge is particularly important for syntax. We know that preschool children from our ELA data who are deaf and hard of hearing and using spoken language tend to use less complex syntax than our children with typical hearing. So in one of our published studies, we were able to find out that children who are deaf and hard of hearing had lower rates of coordinated clause use, subordinate clause use, and simple infinitives. So those are like these sentences to the side. A coordinated clause is, I like dogs, but my mom likes cats. A subordinate clause, so putting these kind of two clauses or sentences together that have active verbs, is Sam was late because he missed the bus. Or the zoo is going to close early today as a simple infinitive. And we found that children who are deaf and hard of hearing had lower accuracy with simple infinitives, so they used fewer of them and were more likely to make errors with infinitives. Were more likely to make errors with full propositional complements, so that would be a sentence like, I think that my teacher is nice. And they were more likely to make errors with subject relative clauses. The girl who was late didn't get breakfast. So we're thinking about how vocabulary might underlie, or differences in vocabulary might underlie delays in the development of this syntax skill. One of the things that we've really noticed as we've dug into this data is that oftentimes words that help build complex sentences are often concept words. So these that I've listed below, before, after, since, while, unless, those are all words that children use to help build complex sentences, and in particular, subordinate clauses. So if a child is learning fewer concept words than their peers with typical hearing, even if they have the same score on a single word vocabulary measure, we might see that that difference in word knowledge exacerbates learning some syntactic forms that typical hearing children are using. So concept knowledge is likely feeding into syntax. Concept word knowledge is also likely feeding into print knowledge, this emergent literacy skill. Print knowledge is comprised of a couple of different things, and I would say out in the field, I see it mostly measured as alphabet knowledge, probably because that's pretty easy to test, right? And we know it's important. So alphabet knowledge is a part of print knowledge where you can name letters and you know what sound they make. But conceptual print knowledge is also a really important part of that umbrella of print knowledge. Conceptual print knowledge is your understanding of how print and books work. And it's something that I find we tend to teach less explicitly, but we expect children pick up this knowledge in shared reading interactions. So if you have conceptual print knowledge, which is one of those pieces of print knowledge, you would be able to complete these tasks or do these things. You could show me the front of the book. You could show me which page you read first. You can show me just one letter on the page, or the longest word, or the first word on a page. And hopefully you're noticing that I'm using a lot of concept words there. Interestingly, even really small children who have typical hearing start developing a lot of conceptual print knowledge that we can test pretty early, even as toddlers. So one of the questions we asked in the ELA study in our early data set was what was happening with concept knowledge for print print concept knowledge for children with cochlear implants and hearing aids as compared to children with typical hearing. And one of the findings that we uncovered that was most surprising to us is not so much that children with typical hearing had more print knowledge, often by age between ages 4 and 6, than children who were deaf and hard of hearing, but rather that children with typical hearing were performing better because they were leveraging items with concept words when they were showing us their conceptual print knowledge. Children who were deaf and hard of hearing were not using concept words to show us what they understood. And so we've been hypothesizing that maybe concept vocabulary doesn't only drive differences in syntactic outcomes, but it might also drive differences in some of this emergent literacy knowledge that then can lead to later deficits in conventional literacy knowledge. Okay, so we've talked about concept word knowledge. I'm sorry, this gets a little messy in my trying to map everything out. Let's also talk about organizational word knowledge. So organizational word knowledge, and particularly that phonological organization, has started to show some evidence that children who are deaf and hard of hearing have phonology knowledge and phonological processing knowledge that might be related to their phonological organization of their semantic knowledge. So your phonological organization influences other phonological development for you. So if you remember sorry for the messy circle that I drew, but one of the organization systems that I suggested we might have with dog related dog to other words that are phonologically similar, like dig or frog. When children develop these high density networks of words or organization systems based on phonology, they have to start paying attention to individual phonemes and words. And that's a precursor skill for the development of phonological awareness. And that's the ability to recognize and hopefully eventually through phonemic awareness, manipulate sounds within words. So it's what lets me put together the sounds k, a, t to form cat, to recognize that those three sounds come together to form one word. So what happens with children who are deaf and hard of hearing? Well, we have some good news and some bad news. If you remember, our children from the LS study who have cochlear implants and hearing aids tend to know fewer high-density words and use that organization structure less than children with typical hearing. However, we do find that for those children who recognize high-density connections between words, that performance correlates with better performance on phonological awareness tasks. So at age 5, both children with typical hearing, as they are learning to read, and children with cochlear implants and hearing aids are relying on that phonological organization knowledge to complete phonological awareness tasks. But by the time we get to second grade or following second grade, we find that only our children with cochlear implants and hearing aids are still relying on those cues to be able to sound out words, to complete phonological awareness tasks, to do all kinds of things. So there's evidence that this vocabulary knowledge and the types of words that you know and whether they are phonologically organized is influencing some of your later emergent literacy skills. And that's an important thing for us to know, both that children with cochlear implants and children with hearing aids can use that knowledge to develop phonological awareness skills, and that children who are deaf and hard of hearing are less likely to learn high density words. And so we might want to think about, well, why do they know fewer high density words, and could we help them learn more? I also talked to you about semantic organizational knowledge of words. So your semantic organizational knowledge also likely influences your access to words. So it's not enough just to have a phonological organization system, but you also want access to words through a semantic system as well. And your semantic system is likely influencing a bunch of your oral language skills that are contributing to your emergent literacy profile. So we have just started asking this question: does semantic or thematic taxonomic organization relate to children's language outcomes? So one of the questions we've asked with our Ella data is, when we measure the strategies that children use to organize words, and in this study we looked at semantically related responses. Did they use overall semantic strategies? Did they use Clang responses, which are like phonological responses? Did they use thematic responses? That's taxonomic. And did they use syntactic responses? And what we found is that at age 5, children's semantically related responses to kind of our organizational strategies and their thematically related responses are predicting their overall language outcomes in first grade. So children who are figuring out the semantic relationships between words and figuring out thematic taxonomic relationships between words tend to have better language outcomes later than those kids who are still learning a bunch of words, but maybe struggling to make connections between those words. Interestingly, we also tracked nonverbal IQ for these kids, and nonverbal IQ was not predicting, or their ability to use those organization systems was not predicting their nonverbal IQ, but it was predicting their language use. That was a mouthful. Sorry. So we know that concept word knowledge then is maybe driving syntax and maybe driving some of our print knowledge. And our organizational word knowledge is driving some of our phonology development, our overall omnibus oral language development, and some of our phonological processing and all kinds of different things. Our hypothesis then would be that these types of word knowledge, concept word knowledge and organizational word knowledge, influence conventional literacy. So what happens if there are all of these early relationships to those later skills of decoding and comprehension? So we've been thinking about this in a couple of different ways. One of the things we're thinking about right now is, does knowledge of those high density or high phonotactic probability words influence your ability to decode or read words in grade 1 through your phonological awareness? So what that means is your vocabulary driving your phonological awareness that's then driving your decoding? Or is it just vocabulary that influences your decoding? And the answer is yes, vocabulary seems related to decoding, but it's through phonological awareness. And specifically, it's related to those phonological organization systems that we talked about. So we're seeing that children who know more high density words and recognize phonological connections and organizations between words tend to be able to leverage those skills to develop solid phonological awareness skills. And through that development of phonological awareness based on their vocabulary, then they are better at decoding or pseudo word reading. That's how we often measure whether or not you are good at sounding out words, even if we take the meaning out of them. So, kind of step 1, is our word knowledge influencing our decoding? The answer seems to be yes. We've also wondered, what about that organizational word knowledge? Do semantic responses or taxonomic responses generated in a repeated word association task at age 5 correlate with the different kinds of reading measures we could think about, or spelling? So I told you a little bit earlier that we did this task at age 5 where we were looking at the strategies children use to organize their words through a task called repeated word association. We looked at children's tendencies to use semantic strategies to organize their words as compared to non-semantic strategies that kind of look like no strategies, but just not connecting the word to anything. And we looked at their tendency to use taxonomic connections as well. Did they understand the categories that words fell into? Could they flexibly use those categories to think about connections between words? And we wanted to know, does your tendency to use semantic organizational strategies or taxonomic organizational strategies correlate with your single word expressive vocabulary knowledge at age 5? Does it correlate with your sight word reading efficiency at first grade? And does it correspond with your phonemic decoding efficiency at grade 1? And on the test of written spelling, does it relate to your ability to spell words? So what you can see here from the data I've got up is that we did find significant correlations between your understanding of semantic connections between words and your performance on all of those other skills. So if you are good at semantic organization, you also tend to be good at sight word reading, at non-word reading, decoding, and at spelling. Whereas single word vocabulary alone was only a predictor of spelling. Relative to taxonomic knowledge, we found that taxonomic knowledge also tended to influence sight word reading efficiency, which is also important for us to think about because it means our organizational knowledge is really driving our later decoding and probably comprehension outcomes. I don't have an analysis for you here looking at concept vocabulary predicting these later outcomes, but we know too that concept words are important, and we can infer that if concept words influence your syntax and they're likely to influence your print knowledge, that they are also going to influence, probably most likely, your comprehension skills when you're learning to read. So what do I want you to take away here and to really think about? Some clinical implications. One, I'm hoping that this data help get you thinking about that for children who are deaf and hard of hearing and learning spoken language, there are differences for our children who are learning spoken language in their concept vocabulary knowledge and their organizational vocabulary knowledge as compared to children with typical hearing. So these are two areas where we might have children who perform in the range of normal on the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, perform in the range of normal on the Expressive Vocabulary Test, or look like they have as many words as their peers with typical hearing, but they might not have the same words. And these are areas to really zero in on and ask, but do they have concept vocabulary? Do they know how the words that they have relate to each other? That's a kind of vocabulary depth, a kind of vocabulary knowledge. So we know there are some documented differences potentially for children who are deaf and hard of hearing here. And we also know that the types of words you know are likely to influence your emergent literacy skills and then later your conventional literacy skills too. And that's an important thing for us to think about. Moving on kind of clinically, if you've bought that we should be thinking about concept vocabulary knowledge and organizational vocabulary knowledge, then I would say for intervention, not only do we need to assess those things, but we also need to think about how we might build these concepts for our children who use hearing aids and cochlear implants. Concept words can make great vocabulary goals. They're a little bit harder to teach than a word like apple, but you get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of what you might be building syntactically later. And also, one of the things we maybe want to think about in intervention is that pointing out connections between words, even connections that aren't purely thematic, but maybe thinking about what connections are between this word and other words I could use in a sentence, or connections between this word and other words that sound like this word, could be a really great addition to vocabulary interventions. Because just teaching vocabulary or focusing on growing that quantity count probably isn't going to help us hit some of these word type differences that we're seeing across this population. So I've listed a couple of preliminary studies here that might help you inform your intervention choices for these targets. And I'll talk you through just a couple of things that I find helpful in terms of teaching vocabulary knowledge, excuse me, and thinking about how we might teach organizational knowledge too. Across some of this intervention work that we've done over the last decade, we find that the most effective way to teach new vocabulary, especially tricky vocabulary, to children who listen through a cochlear implant or a hearing aid is to use direct instruction. And so this comes in multiple different forms, but more or less, we've demonstrated that it's probably not enough to just repeat a word to a kid in context and expect them to learn it. Rather, asking the kid to really zero in on that word and really focus on that word is important. And also asking them to engage in repetitive practice, or sometimes it's called retrieval practice, can be really helpful for teaching new vocabulary to children who struggle to learn new vocabulary. Concept words present an interesting case because it's hard for me to teach a word like first without having some other considerations. So, the protocol that we've been using in my lab to teach concept words really focuses on introducing concept words in isolation. I think many of us have a tendency to want to teach concept words in terms of their opposite, which can be great if you know the opposite word. But if you don't know the opposite word, then you're teaching two words at once. So we have found more effective practice is to teach a word like first and contrast it with not first, rather than teaching first and last if you don't have either of those words. So we isolate the word. We make sure that we go back and forth between examples of that word. So we might put first in lots of different contexts and point out who is not first. And we give the child chances to practice that both expressively and receptively. So those are just some things to think about relative to teaching concept words. And then relative to teaching organization, a series of studies that we have done finds that actually it might be helpful to connect the new words that you're teaching to other words, especially words that the child already knows. So what this looks like is creating semantically rich word learning opportunities. It's not just repeating a word over and over, but rather giving additional linguistic information about that word and maybe even physical experience with the word. So, the example I usually use when I talk about this is for the word popcorn. If I'm teaching popcorn, we find it's going to be more effective to teach popcorn if I also talk about all of the things I know about popcorn, which can be kind of counterintuitive because it might seem like it would be easier to learn if I just said the word by itself over and over. And that's not quite true. Rather, I need to talk about that popcorn is salty and maybe we eat it at the movies and we make it in the microwave. And for some children, actually experiencing popcorn and touching popcorn might make that word more sticky than if I just say it on its own over and over. In one of the studies we did, and actually we've repeated this a couple of times in my lab, we found that the good news is giving additional linguistic experience with a new word. So pointing out connections just verbally, even when you can't physically, for most children is sufficient to help them start building those organizational strategies. So you don't just want to say words in isolation, but you want to give lots of additional information. For children who maybe also have some cognitive delays, and I'm talking about nonverbal cognitive delays, in those cases, it was really important to incorporate the physical experience as well to teaching the new words to help them build connections across those words. So overall, I'm hoping that kind of what you're taking away here is that we need to look for differences in the types of words that our children with cochlear implants and hearing aids know as compared to their typical hearing peers when they're developing spoken language. And then if we've ascertained that there's a difference, we need to start thinking about this for our intervention. We need to really think about, am I teaching concept words on purpose? And am I teaching connections between words on purpose? Because ultimately, those have these cascading effects on later literacy skills. So we can start almost working on literacy early by thinking about vocabulary learning differences early. So with that, I think I'm doing okay on time. I would love to open up the floor for your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lund. That was really helpful and interesting information about the differences. Have you, one of the questions is, um, there is difference, clearly, that you showed that there is a definite difference between typically hearing and kids with the hearing loss. Have you talked at all or looked into why? I mean, we know there's a difference, but
Mhm.
speculating, I know that's probably future research too, but have you had any thoughts or any discussions about why you think those differences are really pretty significant when you look at the lines that you showed?
Sure. So I'll break down my answer,
Okay.
just speculating why, into our concept words and our organizational words. So, my suspicion with concept word knowledge is that having experienced a period of time where you maybe don't have access to language through your cochlear implant or hearing aid, and or when people are really teaching you in a very structured way your new words, it means that you don't develop some of the word learning strategies that children with typical hearing develop over time. And so I suspect when you are not great at word learning from your environment, that both the adults around you may not think as often to teach you concept words, and it might be harder for you to just pick them up from the environment because cognitively you're dealing with lots of things, trying to parse through using this sound stimulation that's coming into your brain, starting to acquire language. Concept words just are not heavy hitters in terms of being super content heavy, and they tend to be more like connector words and sentences. So, my suspicion is that these are words that really, with intervention, we probably do need to point out to children because they're not picking them up on their own. And so they're steering more towards some of those content words. That's pure speculation on my part.
Well, and if I can just I mean, that incidental learning is something we always are considering, and that could very well be, I mean, that was kind of what came to my mind, but I didn't know if you'd had any, and what you're saying is it perhaps could be that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So incidental learning could be very much related to the concept outcomes. With organization outcomes, phonologically, I suspect that it really is a function of listening through a device because, as I think I just said really quickly earlier, it makes sense that it would be harder to learn two words that are very similar, like cat and mat, if I'm not confident in what I'm hearing. It would probably be easier for me to learn cat and dog because those are two really contrastive words. But children with typical hearing actually tend to leverage similarity when they're learning new words and find it easier to learn words that sound similar to each other. This is me speculating. I think it might be related to because they are confident in what they are hearing. And so if you kind of get used to the idea that, like, oh, this is new stimulation, this is new information coming into my brain, listening through a device, or often I don't hear things right, so I'm not sure what I'm hearing. It would potentially make it harder to learn phonologically similar words and then build those strategies to have phonological organization. Semantically, I think that might be related to some of that overhearing too, and just making connections when cognitively language learning is just a heavy lift. And so perhaps through intervention, children who are listening through hearing aids and cochlear implants need that extra boost to be able to really zero in on that these phonological connections between words and these semantic connections between words are really important.
Along that line, what advice for folks, for our audience that are working with parents, what kind of guidance should we be giving parents to help them, what strategies to use to help them develop both the organizational and concept word knowledge with their children?
Yeah, so that I think being aware that concept words exist and that even though they seem hard to teach, that they're really important is just an important message to get out there to caregivers. So if caregivers are acting as the teacher of their child, we want to make sure that they're super aware that words like first and second and before and because are all really important words to use and to use often and to highlight acoustically. So I guess that would be one thing I would say. And then in terms of organization, I would encourage people to think about how talking to parents about how they should elaborate on the words that they are using, even in ways that may not be blatantly obvious. So if I'm teaching a new word, I don't only need to talk about maybe the physical characteristics of the thing that I'm teaching. So if I'm teaching apple, but I also might talk about what other words sound like apple. Or do you remember that, something that ends in ol, the way apple does, is this other word? So just kind of helping parents pick up on that more information is good because I think our instinct is to think that less information might be good when I'm
That's
teaching
great.
something new.
That's great. So, one of the questions that has been posed, have you looked into this same issues with children who have single-sided deafness?
We have not. Single-sided deafness is not part of our current research study. I would say, anecdotally, from my clinical practice, at least relative to concept words, I'm seeing some of these same issues in children with single-sided deafness. So I don't have a research answer, but I would say that thinking about the types of words that children with single-sided deafness know would be a good next step if that's a large part of your practice.
Mhm. Makes sense. Somebody else asks, what role perhaps listening effort is playing in this? Could these children perhaps be expending all of their listening reserves to listening and therefore so that they can hear and understand, and then therefore they're missing some of these
Other things.
subtle, yeah, these other things. I was trying to think of the right word. Yeah, but these other things, that's a good way to put it.
Yes. I think that absolutely is likely to play into especially the lack of learning we see from incidental listening. It is hard to parse all of the sound in your environment, just not only physically, but also mentally. That's a large cognitive load. And so if your listening effort gives you a smaller bucket with which to process all of the things coming in, that could definitely be a space where our children who are listening through devices are struggling to acquire organizational knowledge or concept vocabulary knowledge. And our children with typical hearing who aren't expending the same listening effort are not struggling as much.
That
So
makes
I
sense.
think that's
Yeah. So
definitely possible.
one final question. We have people in our audience from all around the world, and so the question is: do you think the concept between the organizational and concept vocabulary holds across languages, or is this, do you think, specific to English, or can you
That's a great,
surmise or estimate? Yeah,
yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I would say in terms of language structure, and I'm familiar with a few languages other than English, I am not aware of a language that does not include concept words. And so I would think that if it is listening through a device and listening effort and incidental learning that may drive some differences in our acquisition of concept words, that would not be language specific. But I don't necessarily have data that absolutely say that. And then if we're thinking about organization, this is a feature of kind of human language knowledge that we have what we call lexical semantic organization systems. And so we would expect, again, that in other languages, the way that we organize our words, even if it doesn't look the same as it does, say, phonologically in English, that the organizational strategies we use still need to exist in other languages.
makes good sense. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lund. There were so many positive comments and thank yous in our chat from our attendees. There were more than 200, there have been more than 200 people here for this afternoon, almost well, 224 right now. So it's been a very popular talk, and we really appreciate your coming and sharing your research. And we look forward to seeing your future research and what additional insights you're able to provide from the work that you're doing at the university. So thank you so much. And
Thank
to our
you.
participants, don't forget to fill out that learning assessment and CEU form at the end and submit it as soon as you possibly can. Again, thank you and enjoy the rest of the day.